The Games Institute is the part of the so-called Haldeman Tract, which is the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Neutral peoples. And we have been acknowledging that presence here on campus, but also, I'm going to speak for myself in my personal life, but I know that a number of our membership has been doing the same. The acknowledgement comes from the fact that the Haldeman Tract and the land we're on, so 6 miles or 10 kilometers on either side of the Grand River, was taken without consent from the First Nations I had just named, then returned back to them in the Haldeman Tract Treaty. The treaty, technically speaking, has been upheld, but somehow we all are here. And so what that makes me think of is how different of an understanding the European settlers and the indigenous people here on Turtle Island actually have about the concept of ownership land. And so treaties, as they were signed back then, I'm not quite sure we can call them in good faith at this point because of this cultural clash. So I will, if you're not in Waterloo region or outside of the Haldeman Tract Treaty, I will invite you to put a note in the chat to acknowledge the territory you're on. And if not, then I hope that you can all join me in recognizing this land and the traditional knowledge and cultural and language heritage that we have to acknowledge while we're here. The Games Institute has always had a large focus on uplifting excluded and silenced voices. So women in games, it was the first thing we started with. But as we go along, there are other excluded or traditionally silenced groups that we would like to invite into our community and amplify their voices. So one of the things that we have done as an institute here, if you're not online, you can see around you there's quite a few plants now, and that has been a couple of the last few weeks that we've been doing this. For those of you online, actually you can see some of the plants behind the panelists. This is our first attempt at greening the office and making the space a little bit more friendly to Indigenous people who need, and it's part of their lifestyle, part of their culture is to have strong connections to nature. So this is our way of bringing that in. But welcome to the Games Institute. I don't actually know if there's anyone that isn't part of the Games Institute. Yes. So if we have people who are external, just very quickly, the Games Institute is a and interdisciplinary research institute that invites people who do all sorts of really interesting research on games, interactive technologies, immersive technologies, and human-computer interaction. And as you were here, health and games and interactive technologies as well. So there's room for pretty much everyone. We have representatives from all faculties on campus. And our job is to foster connections and make your lives easier if you want to work across disciplinary lines, or if you want to dabble into research that you have never touched. We have people who are very willing to share their knowledge, and we try to, as much as possible, provide an environment, an ecosystem where we can enable people to talk across disciplinary lines, use our ecosystem labs that we have here for those conversations, for new collaborations, and hopefully create a little bit of an added value to your work. And with that, I will introduce to you Dr. Emma Vossen. Emma, wave. There we go. That's Emma. Emma will be our panelist for our moderator for the panel today. She is the Games Institute Research Communications Officer, I think the official title is. And so she will introduce our speakers and then manage the conversation that goes along. If you have questions here in person, raise your hand and make sure that Emma can see you. If you're online, put your virtual hand up and Emma will note the order of questions. We will have a Q&A period at the end, correct? So are we taking questions in the meantime during the panel itself?
You can feel free to pop your question in the chat if you want to, or just hold on to it till the end. We're going to do virtual questions first and then audience questions after.
Thank you.
I think the only thing you're missing is the door prize.
Yes, I'm getting there.
Oh,
so before I get to the door prize, yes, Michael is holding it up. Michael, you have to say something.
Right, I have to say, this is the amazing door prize. There we go.
Yes.
You can note the first author is Lili, so she'll be speaking about the book. It looks like an awesome book.
Yeah, so I will tell you how you can win the prize in a second. For the panel itself, I will ask the online audience to mute your microphones, keep your cameras on, so that, as I mentioned, the panelists can see you. Once Emma recognizes your online question, she can either read it if you type it in, or you can enable your microphone, and we'll go from there. The door prize, yes, Lili has been kind enough to bring a book that she had co-authored. The title is Autonomy and Independence, Aging in an Era of Technology. And I don't know how to, there we go, how to get the camera. So for those of you who are here in person, we'll pass a clipboard, put your name in one of the boxes, and then we'll cut them up and put them in a jar. And for the online audience, I will also do that once the panel starts. I will take your names down, add them to the jar. Also, at the very end of the panel, Salma, our operations coordinator, will post a link with a discount code, I believe, for the book that Lili has graciously provided to us as well. Any questions before we get going? You know what's interesting about hybrid events? I have to look all around because I have people here, I have people over there. There's a camera right in front of me, so I'm trying to look at it, but I can also see the feed from over there on the screen. I'm really confused about where I am. So before I get with a full-on vertigo attack, Emma, I'll leave it up to you to introduce our guests. And thank you very much, online and in-person people, for joining us today.
Awesome, thank you. Hi, everyone. So as Agata said, we're going to do some pre-established questions first, then we're going to move on to the virtual audience questions, then some in-person audience questions. And I'm not going to talk too long because I'm just hoping that you all will be happy to introduce yourselves, give us a few minutes about your work to sort of establish the discussion. And if we can start with you, John, if that's okay.
Yeah, that sounds good. Nice meeting you all. Thank you for being here. My name is John. I just recently completed a postdoctoral fellowship here. I have been at the Games Institute for 3 years, also working with some faculty members in system design engineering and healthcare kinesiology. I love doing games, and when I started working with games, I also tried to drive or steer a little bit the purpose of those games towards something health related. So did my PhD in human-computer interaction, and I was working with exergaming, so fun ways of doing exercise, and especially working with older adults. My specialty is in trying to work along with physiological sensors and trying to better quantify how good or how healthy are those games, and what are the potential benefits that they would be able to bring to different populations.
Awesome. Okay, Lili?
Yeah, hi everyone. So my name is Lili Liu, and by way of a background, because it's going to influence some of the content that I'll be presenting or discussing today. For those of you that don't know, my health professional background is as an occupational therapist. So I did my occupational therapy qualification as well as my graduate education at McGill University in rehabilitation science. And way back then, I had developed an interest in wayfinding or spatial orientation, or shall we say disorientation, in individuals with living with dementia. And then fast forward to my academic career, almost 27 years at the University of Alberta, and progressed through the ranks from assistant professor all the way up to full professor, and then eventually as chair of the Department of Occupational Therapy. So that's my background, and I arrived here at the University of Waterloo 3 years ago and assumed the position of dean. I've managed to maintain a research program. I realize that's very difficult to do, and certainly is, I don't think, expected of senior administrators. It's just sort of a, wait and see how it goes, and it's been progressively even more successful than before. I want to say that this book actually was co-written by, every single member was either a PhD student, eventually a postdoc, or was a postdoc of mine. So it's like the song Hotel California, they sign on, they check out, but they never leave. So my team keeps getting larger and larger. I have a really large research team consisting of undergraduate, co-op, all the way up to postdoc students. And it's just a well-oiled machine. The nature of our work is such that because I had arrived in just before the pandemic, we had about 6 or 7 months of getting acclimatized to distance collaboration. So I do work across the country, particularly with University of Alberta. But when the pandemic hit, it didn't affect it at all. We were already, so our research program was now held back, so we consistently were able to be productive. In today's panel discussion, time permitting and interest permitting, I'll be referring to like the We Connect, virtual reality, serious mobile games, digital storytelling, as some of the interactive platforms that we use. And from the perspective of a rehab professional, we advise and are consulted and are real partners in the development of the games and also of validating them for assessment and intervention. However, we're not the experts, of course, in the coding and the background, but we really do set the what the end product should look like for the computing science and the other kinds of partners that we work with, so that in the end, we represent the end users to the best of our ability. Thank you.
Michael.
Great. Hi, I'm Michael Barnett-Cowan. I'm an Associate Professor of Neuroscience in the Department of Kinesiology and Health Sciences. I've been here at the University of Waterloo for 9 years now, and met Neil pretty much within the first few months, I think, of arriving, when I found out that there was a Games Institute here. And I recognized very early on the importance of working with multidisciplinary teams to tackle really hard problems. A lot of that came out of my training. So I received my master's and PhD from York University's Center for Vision Research, which is a very internationally renowned Center for Vision Research, and works both with engineers, psychologists, kinesiologists, many different fields to solve problems related to vision. Then I went on to do my postdoc at the Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics in Tübingen, Germany, which has the great fortune of having a lot of fortune in funding to be able to have all sorts of latest tech in virtual reality technology. So they had some of the earliest head-mounted displays, cave devices, omnidirectional treadmills before most people even knew about them. And I was working with motion simulators to solve problems related to upset recovery with airplanes and training pilots in terms of how to recover an airplane when it's falling from the sky, and mimic those conditions using virtual reality as opposed to just taking real planes and making them drop from the sky and training them that way, which is very expensive and very risky. And then I went to Western University just down the road in London, Ontario, to do a postdoc at the Brain and Mind Institute. Again, another large, well-renowned institute with multidisciplinary teams solving big problems. And there I was using fMRI to understand the representation of gravity in the cortex, and how there are individual differences with how people represent gravity and how it informs their decision-making and actions. So here at Waterloo, I do a lot of work related to multisensory integration, so figuring out how does the brain take cues from different senses and put them together, which is highly relevant for virtual reality, where the problem is you're trying to create an alternative version of reality that is supposed to look seamlessly dissimilar from true reality. And that's developed research questions related to immersion, sense of presence, human-computer interaction. And I always try to find some sort of links to health. So a lot of our work has migrated into understanding how the older adult brain changes and with respect to putting sensory information together, not just from your eyes getting worse over time and using corrective lenses, or you're losing your hearing and using like a hearing aid. We're really looking at the central problems, like the changes in your individual neurons, how those change with age, and how that affects your decision making and immersion within virtual reality and interaction. So happy to talk about that today, and I'll talk a little bit about some of my interactions with collaborations with industry, which have been really important for getting some of that work off there now.
Thanks so much, Michael. I think this is all really interesting, because something we talk about a lot is that when you say the word games to the general public, there's this very narrow idea of what that means. It's sort of 1% of all that would be possible with games. It sort of conjures up this image of Grand Theft Auto, and it's limited at that. And I think the three of you really showcase this sort of breadth of, like, there's so many things that can be done with games, that are being done with games, that people wouldn't even imagine. So I think we're really going to dig into that with these questions. So the first thing I want to ask you is, what are some of the ways that you've seen interactive technologies or games improve the lives of people you work with? And whoever feels like going first, I'm not going to make you go in order.
Lili, you go first.
Oh, okay. We're encouraging each other. Yeah. Well, I think I might rephrase that a little bit in terms of improving, because from my perspective, in terms of intervention research or rehab, whenever you use the word improve, you have to demonstrate a pre and a post, and that there's actual positive change, right? But I would say definitely enhance or make meaningful or make much more, facilitate the work, right? And there are different audiences. So in my research, we have seen how interactive and game-related kinds of technologies can enhance the work of rehab professionals and the work that they do. In clients themselves, so the recipient, the end users, their care partners who have to continue to look after them in their home environments, for example. In terms of professionals, and it's not just rehab professionals, I speak more comfortably about them, but it's all health professionals, nurses, physicians, etc. I've seen progressively over the last 2 or 3 decades of work in this area using interactive technologies, the potential in the rapid improvement of the way we can do assessments and interventions. And I have to say, much of this comes immediately after the gaming industry has produced these products. We can't in health afford the kinds of development that the gaming industry can through marketing and etc. So once, for example, the Wii came out, immediately you could see lots of nursing homes, lots of rehab professionals doing home care, etc. Immediately could see, especially occupational therapists, the tremendous benefit that something like this could have for implementing exercise, etc. But from my discipline, it's really important to always find an intervention strategy that appeals to the client. So you can exercise someone, you can have someone develop arm strength after post-stroke or after a car accident, their concentration, their attention, etc. But it has to be through an activity that's meaningful for them. And through games such as those that are available on the market, we could see that. So it was very quickly adopted. And then following that, working with programmers, adapting them to customize them, like the tablet games, to make them therapeutic, even though they may look like any other game, right? So you would have intentional objectives and intentional scaffolding involved, and you can actually measure change over time depending on what you're trying to remove, whether it be eye gazing, left neglect, or whatnot. But to the end user, they don't notice that's actually to them and their grandchildren, perhaps, it just looks like they're playing a game, but you can actually. So for those that are providing these kinds of interventions and assessments, it provides a meaningful way, instead of getting them back in the olden days when I used to be a student, they would lift cones and do these kinds of very repetitive, meaningless tasks. So I would say another benefit to everyone in general is the removal of stigma. We're no longer having these institutional types of approaches to intervention and assessment. The test doesn't really look like a test anymore, so it removes the test anxiety. So it's a general, kind of an overall statement I would make in terms of how the gaming industry has actually benefited the rehab professions anyway, discipline specifically. So, yeah.
That's so interesting what you say too about, the games needing to feel like games, because I feel like there's a lot of discussion, especially around gamification, about games that are also supposed to be educational or beneficial being sort of chocolate covered broccoli. And wanting it to actually feel like a game, so it doesn't feel like, oh, we've just poured some chocolate on something you don't want to eat. Yeah. Anyone else? Interactive technologies improving the lives of people you work with?
I think beyond what Lili was saying, I also have the fortune of working lately with social robots, which is a type of technology that I was not imagining before, to kind of like be able to have that relationship with games. because robots are always super complex systems, and the definition or trying to create games with such complex mechanisms is always a very challenging task. So I think I had a very fast course and human-robot interaction when it came here to Waterloo, and I discovered the potential of also using this more like socially intelligent technologies that may look as a robot, as humanoids, as pets, as a potential way of creating some sort of social engagement with participants that might be probably feeling some level of social isolation or might require any external push to actually interact all together. So I think in my case, I've seen this type of interactive technologies being used as a medium, more as a vehicle to provide the social connection that we all need, especially during the pandemic situations. And that has been very informative and very interesting to discover lately.
That makes sense to me. I couldn't have survived the pandemic without games. Like not even social games, just feeling like you're going somewhere, doing something. It really adds something when you're stuck inside.
I think the pandemic's a perfect lens that we're all kind of consciously looking at right now. For me, it's shown the benefits of the technology that we have right now and a lot of the limitations. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the work that we do here through the Games Institute in co-design, right, where we involve the people that we want to assess, whether it's older adults in the community, whether it's a particular population in business, for example, where they're interested in gamifying the concepts that they want to be able to openly convey with their clients. In some ways, the pandemic just showed us that there's certain advantages, but lots of disadvantages without being able to actually involve those stakeholders in the actual design process. And this is where the connection with the developers and with industry becomes really, really important, because oftentimes in a place like this, in the Games Institute, we have people from multiple disciplines, and John just said, like, he described robotics as sort of very complex and intimidating, right? And that's a common feature. Engineers don't necessarily see them the same way, whereas someone perhaps from the humanities, may see them as a little bit more complicated and inaccessible. Mm-hmm. And I think the important thing is being able to make that technology more accessible to more people, particularly the people that we're interested in testing and assessing and learning more about to help them. That's become really important. So, when Lili's talking about using these games that don't appear to be assessments anymore, one of the other things that these communities had to learn is how do you actually use the technology, right? So, working with VR, we received some of the first commercially available Oculus Rifts when they first came out. Head-mounted displays have existed for quite a while, but they were largely reserved for research institutes, engineering firms. And we came up with a whole bunch of research questions that we wanted to test, and we brought people in from the campus to test them as we normally would. For most of those people, it was the first time they had ever tried virtual reality. They were familiar with it, but it was their very first experience. Or we launched a program out of the Ontario Science Centre. Again, almost everybody who came through, this was the first experience for them. And this was back in 2016. And we realized that, as researchers and our relationship with technology, we're often at the very cutting edge. We're either using the best equipment that we have available, or we're building it. And then if we want to put that out there in the world, we have to appreciate that this is often the very first time that they've ever used them. So in terms of, the thing that I see as a benefit is we're really bringing a new way of interacting for many of these people. And the pandemic, again, circling back to that, everybody had to learn how to use Zoom. Everybody had to use Teams, right? All these different platforms that existed for quite a while. But then it brought the common denominator for human communications up tremendously, while also revealing a lot of the problems with that technology.
Yeah, absolutely. So my next question, Lili already sort of preempted the question a bit, but if you have anything more to add, it would be amazing. I guess the next question was about healthcare workers and caregivers and how these technologies might benefit them as individuals.
Yeah, I did preempt that, but I can certainly add to that. Yeah. Probably I should refer to there was a publication that was mentioned in the advertisement for this, so probably should allude to that a little bit, and that is a publication we put out this year with my colleagues that examined the adoption or the acceptability of 4 serious games that may sound familiar. You know, there's whack-a-mole and there's word search and mahjong and the others bejeweled. So, but we actually co-developed them. So I love that reference to co-developing. We actually co-developed them with older adults, all the way up from the way it appeared visually to the timing of the different levels. So it isn't just one that's, you know, you download off the shelf, that sort of thing. And then we administer them to individuals who had dementia and who didn't have dementia. We also paired each one of these games with a paper version. So in our discipline, we've always used pencil paper versions of these tests. So we paired them up, and the amount of benefits for that first of all, they were accepted, and they used them over time. We could see that many of them were also much more informative than the paper pencil version. Just for example, the timing, the time it takes, the interaction, the way they go about problem solving. In the paper pencil version, you would just see the final result and you would score it, right? Whereas digitally, you would get many more metrics out of that. Plus, you would get, for example, the process that they took to end up at a particular result in the game. But all of this can be done with the therapist sitting across, establishing, maintaining rapport without having to, stopwatch days are gone, right? You don't need the stopwatch anymore, and you can really try and encourage and foster and observe, because the observational kinds of data is also really important for health professionals. So that would definitely be one of the pluses. The other I would just say is that we actually are encouraging now the health discipline to look at novel, innovative ways of assessing cognition, physical function, balance, all of that, without the tendency for health professionals is to take what they do in a standard format and translate it into a digital format. And we're saying you don't need to do that anymore. Just let's start from scratch. Maybe we can streamline and have a very, very short version that's valid of assessing that particular performance much more quickly than back in the days when we had to use it. So there are now many digital validated assessments for cognitive assessment, etc., that are just digital translations of the paper version. And we're saying, please don't do that. Let's really start from scratch, work with our colleagues, like people sitting in this room, and and I think one of the, I'll just end by saying, one of the compelling research that has come out is using our whack-a-mole game. So we were laughing because this was the first time we had seen the word whack-a-mole in a scientific. This is an IEEE publication by our colleagues out in Ottawa, and they had used this adaptive whack-a-mole game that we had developed and administer it to some residential care facility residents. And they were over a course of a year, and they were able to find 4 out of these 12 individuals, dementia had declined substantially from, like, I won't mention all the scores, but quite substantially, to the point where you would say, basically, she's almost vegetative. She's sitting there staring out the window, not doing anything in this one particular case. Yet over the course of that time, her improvement in playing the game went up to the highest level. So it's a really compelling study to show that, in fact, the learning ability to learn is still there, but it's not being picked up by our traditional ways of measuring cognitive function. So we really need to abandon these traditional ways and look at possibly these interactive approaches, especially if it's engaging. We looked at engagement and also positive affect as outcomes. And those scores were really quite compelling. So that, I think, is one of the messages that we like to showcase, to tell people this is really a promising area of development for healthcare practice.
It really shows you how powerful play is and how underestimated it is, you know.
Yeah.
And it also, I mean, the other thing that you're touching on is the importance of working with the caregivers, right, and involving them in these conversations. And yeah, I've done these traditional approaches for cognitive assessment too, and you just kind of know, everybody knows, the patient, the caregiver, the scientists in the room all are aware. There's more to the story than that score that was created. And, you know, that comes out of an older history, right, where we needed to assess many larger groups of people and get the gist and figure out, you have to triage who's going to get the care. But then they're there with their caregivers, supposed to be getting the more immediate care. It's more personalized, and they're stuck with older tools. And sometimes I think, it's hard to be a caregiver, right? And you've got lots of behavioral issues, cognitive issues to deal with. I think the future using, artificial intelligent sort of assistants that are co-created, designed, validated, that can help be a crutch to monitor things that are really hard to monitor. Some behaviors, they're not obvious immediately. You need to really monitor them over time, and whether that's, physical movement based, whether it's decision making in the cognitive space, or whether it's just, how things evolve through gameplay, right? Having somebody who sits there in a vegetative state looking out the window and then all of a sudden is an expert at whack-a-mole. I mean, that's a huge thing, right? And that's just one possible trajectory for improvement. There's so many more potential ways, and we're coming out of an era of institutionalization where, a lot of elderly people in Canada and all across the world were put into these institutions, and this is how we care for them. And we know that that's not the most healthy way to do things.
Yeah.
And so I think it's fantastic. I mean, as you say, gameplay is a core thing of human creativity.
Mm-hmm.
We shouldn't be excluding, any population from being able to play. I think the challenge, though, is to figure out how do we identify the right games, how do we create new games that address the different needs of different people, in hopes of, there's entertainment, recreation, but also rehabilitation and improvement.
I think just coming back to what Michael just said, I think the key aspect of that is really involving not only the players or the potential end users, but also the healthcare practitioners and providers. And what I've noticed is I do a lot of co-designing with multiple healthcare practitioners, and what I've noticed is when you go and involve them only as testers of a technology that you have developed in the lab, there's certain disconnection, and you see it in their faces, and this, the technology most of the times is not able to achieve what it was promising, or you see their disappointed faces when they see VR, the Kinect, or many of the gaming technologies that we have. When you involve them more as informants, so you're constantly asking them about potential ways of improving your prototypes or potential ways of describing what the needs that they have, you start digging more into what they really need, and the challenge there is actually transforming their needs into something that can be playable in a fun way by end users. But the real the change that I've seen in my area is when you empower those therapists as potential game designers. When you show them there's nothing preventing you to actually be a game designer. Indeed, they do that all the time. Throughout the days, their daily life activities, they are finding very creative ways of getting people engaged into the different therapies, into the different routines that they have. And they do that by, using many of the tools that we use in game design, like iterating, like play testing with participants. They just don't call it play testing. They just don't call it prototyping or iteration. But this is what they do. So when you come with a little bit of that knowledge and background in game design, and you actually empower them being able to express their ideas and transform those ideas into something fun for the potential end users, that's what I see the great games being created.
Yeah, and now we've touched on sort of the accessibility of the technology itself, the accessibility of play, and then even the accessibility of game design, and sort of, taking that intimidation away and just saying to people, you've already done this. It's really not as scary as it sounds, and I think that's important. So my next question is, I was hoping that one or all of you could talk about the links between cognitive and physical stimulation in your work, which I think we touched on a little bit already, but.
I can speak to that. I mean, we do assessments and decision making quite a lot. Again, most of our work is decision making related to, where or when various sensory events are occurring in your environment. So it's fairly basic level kind of science that we're doing in sensory sciences. But then we relate those to other behaviors that may be problematic. So problems with reading comprehension, problems with balance control, for example, trying to see if we can develop simple assessments from decision making and related to problems that are either happening or have the potential to occur into the future. In the cognitive space, it's interesting the relationship between cognitive assessments and gaming. There were some really big studies that came out probably about 10 years ago now, trying to figure out whether gaming can improve cognition, can improve your intelligence. And a lot of those studies came out showing that there isn't really a big change that'll occur in terms of your typical sample sizes of the normal population. But then obviously in these more clinically applied cases like what Lili was talking about, where you enable somebody who has been disengaged largely and then allow them to have access to this technology, really demonstrate, well, how good are you? Because how often did this person, to use another example of whack-a-mole, like how often do they play whack-a-mole in their life, right? It's not something that's allowed to be expressed necessarily. And so a lot of these technologies enable the expression of cognitive and physical abilities that aren't typically necessarily being encouraged or very sort of constrained under certain sort of assessments that are done. But I think this idea of improvement and getting better, one of the things that does a disservice to is it sort of attaches the engagement factor. So, I mean, games may not increase your IQ, but they keep you engaged, right? And we know that playing games and being engaged socially is important for prevention of dementia, right? You may be genetically predetermined to have an increased likelihood of developing dementia. If you live a healthier lifestyle, which includes playing games, which includes being social, you may stem the onset of some of those symptoms to happen later in life as opposed to earlier. So I think the theme that I'm seeing is there's a rethinking, I think, of aging and gaming in general that's occurring right now. The challenge in the future will be, how do we make it better, right? This transition away from paper and pencil, these, the deinstitutionalized approach to healthcare. What will that future be, and what tools will be helpful, and what are the limits of those tools, right? And it's great to say technology is going to save us, but we know from history it's not going to. It's just going to give us a different angle to approach things. So I'm excited to see where that goes.
It's interesting too, because I think one of the things you're hitting on is like what can and cannot be measured. And I remember 10 years ago when people would say, like, they would even market games as like, oh, brain age, it makes you smarter. And it's like, well, there's really no way to prove that. But maybe it makes you happier, maybe it makes you less anxious, maybe it makes you less depressed. But how could we ever measure these things? Like, how could we know?
I think one of the things that I've been using lately to actually somehow connect those things is to record, analyze, and try to translate our physiological responses. And that's an entire, big field which is trying to use those responses, many different sensors that are somehow intrusive sometimes they're wearable, to try to disentangle the relationship between those games, the amount of time that you play those games, and your actual measure physiological well-being. And what I being able to find out is, especially when working with older adults, there's a lot of those physiological parameters that are well established already by the healthcare, research community. So they work along all the time with movement, with cardiovascular health, with neurophysiological responses. In my case, coming more from an engineering background and doing a little bit of human-computer interaction, the point is, how do you use those technologies that are available to actually integrate those games into the daily life practices of people that are needing, so rehabilitation, engineering, exercise promotion in older adults. And how do you actually show that some of the signals, some of the responses that people are having when interacting with the games are connected to a better mental or physical health. In my case, I was working mostly with cardiovascular sensors, and there is this whole bunch of metrics of heart rate and heart rate variability that are constantly pointed out to a better cardiovascular health, especially in older adults. And we were doing multiple games where we were constantly recording those metrics and showing how those metrics were changing, not only when people were interacting with the game, but after 3-4 months of constant exposition to those games. In our case, we managed to show, for instance, how games that are able to use this heart rate information, for instance, to adapt dynamically the game, we're able to push people towards a more healthy cardiorespiratory session just because they were spending more time in the specific zone where they were supposed to be. And that's something that we are still trying to encourage and to use, especially when working with games, because interfacing those games with those sensors is constantly a challenge, just because those are like two different areas of bioengineering, developing sensors and protocols, and games, which are not necessarily very famous for using those type of sensors. So it's one of the potential ways of using and integrating more measurable variables to better quantify the potential benefits of using games.
I would agree with Michael and John. From a rehab perspective, we look at all of our clients holistically. So while our goal may be to improve attention or try and mitigate some of the issues from a cognitive impairment, we always think about the physical elements as well. And for working on a physical stamina or endurance, we also think about the cognitive element, in particular motivation and engagement. So a good example that involves games would be a virtual gym that we had also developed, where a physiotherapist or an occupational therapist might prescribe certain exercises for the person to do at home. It would be something that they put onto their TV, and they would follow this avatar to do the exercise, and then remotely they can adjust the level of difficulty. So I was never a good patient of physiotherapy, but I thought this is something that will work for me. You gamify it, and you have different levels that you want to achieve on a particular time. Rather than the physio saying you got to do this many repetitions and this, but you also have a visual to show you whether you're doing it correctly or not, then there's adjustments, right? So that's a really good example of using a game to promote and foster a physical exercise routine that also involves gamifying, right, and using them. So I will share one interesting anecdote, and that is has to do with human-computer interaction. And that is, the tablet is actually a relatively recent kind of innovation, right? And so we are seeing cohort effects that may not exist by the time, our students age in 20, 30 years, for example. And that is that in one particular study we did, and this is, we didn't have a research question related to this, but it appeared to us, it was quite evident that there were a handful, a very small number of older adults that could not learn how to use their fingers to interact with a tablet, with a touch screen. And it wasn't because their skin, sometimes it's because the skin is too dry, it doesn't relate well with the screen. But it was a research assistant, a grad student or undergrad student who said, why don't we give them a stylus? We put the stylus in their hand, immediately they were able to use it. So they relate to the pencil or pen as a writing instrument. And yet they couldn't, no matter how much we tried, they were getting frustrated. They couldn't use their fingers to do all the different, even just to touch or to move. So I thought that was really interesting. And it may not be a phenomenon we'll see in 20, 30 years when everybody is used to the touch screen, right? So I wonder what other sort of cohort kinds of phenomenon are out there that we're not aware of. And here we keep pushing technology on seniors, right?
That's really interesting. I mean, especially thinking about how, you see like toddlers almost instinctively knowing how to use their hands.
Yeah. That's right.
So my next question, I sort of want to circle back to something I touched on in the beginning, which is, do you think there are certain limitations on the way that the general public think about games and interactive technologies as tools for health? Because, historically, games have been sort of culturally positioned as inherently unhealthy.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a stigma, right? You'll be curious. I keep wondering what's going to happen on the flip side of the pandemic, right? Because I think, everybody got more involved with using technology for communications, the sort of way in which you had a little bit more freedom to blend your recreational time with your work time. And I think a lot of what came out of that was like the social common denominator, like the entire world, right, had to kind of adapt this way. Now, there's going to be some other things that come out of that too, like the socioeconomic things. Like some people had access to technology to be able to communicate, others didn't, right? We still have people who have, not as much access to computing, not as much access to, high-speed internet. I think governments have been trying in their government way to respond to that and recognize that, really we need to enable more people around the world to have these, because it's being recognized as a really important tool to be able to communicate, and then ultimately playing games. But I don't know about the stigma, how it's going to evolve and change over time. I think it gets back to just recreation in general, right? And the definition of what is a game, right? I mean, sitting here at the Games Institute, everybody here is going to know, like, games are more than just a recreational game, something to pass the time with. They can morph into all sorts of different iterations. You can do work through games, right? It all depends on how it's designed in the first place. And I guess what I hope to see is that there's more potential for involving multiple stakeholders, and gamifying is being used quite a lot now. I think there'll be another evolution beyond just the basic elements of gamifying, collecting more information, which is the typical sort of approach, to more like, how do we create work to be more like a game, right? We want our work to be engaging, we want it to be productive, but sometimes it's a drag, right? And it's funny because if you think of the stigma about games, a lot of it comes from this association with the game having you sit, down for long periods of time. Wow, imagine a workforce that sits in cubicles in front of a screen all day, right? And it's not that different from doing spreadsheets. It's just it's how the productive, like what are the tangible little beans that are being counted as being productive amount to be. So, I'm hoping that society in general will embrace more alternative forms of work through digital communication tools, through human-computer interaction tools, and also learn, like, how can you be productive in a sort of a gamified work environment.
And I think you're really touching on how there's such a blurring of labor and leisure during the pandemic, and those things happening simultaneously, which category things fall in. Like, think about so many of my friends are artists and animators, and now post-pandemic, the idea of them doing their work and not also listening to a podcast, watching a YouTube video, like it would be wild to them. That's just how they do their work now. And I don't think that was quite the case before, when everyone was in the office being monitored.
Well, just to follow up quickly on that, like, I think a lot of this comes down to trust.
Yeah.
Right. I think from an institutionalized workplace environment, it's all about control. Right. You are the employees. You are to do these jobs. I quantify the way in which you perform these jobs, and I will choose to reimburse you accordingly based on these outputs. And it's oppressive, right? I mean, I think most people can appreciate that form of work can be oppressive. It can lead to production, but there's a lack of trust there. And I think one of the things that coming through the pandemic and using these interactive technologies has done, and one of the things I think we want to do through the Games Institute's initiative for working towards the digital future, is to figure out, how do we regain trust in a way, in a workplace environment, in a teaching environment, that can encourage a mutual trust that it's okay to be in a meeting while you're walking the dog, right? We trust that you are paying attention to what's going on, and we trust that you will be engaged in this conversation, and not have to force you to be at a table, at a physical place and time. And I don't know how that's going to come to pass, but I think if it's going to acknowledge our communal sort of mental health and how we're going to move forward as humans in a very diverse, interactive, digital/physical presence way, we really need to address that. And I think universities are the perfect testing beds to figure that out.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like there needs to be like a redistribution of power to be a redistribution of trust. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that topic? Or
I think Michael covered it well. The only thing I would add is another source of perhaps a stigma related to gaming would be that perhaps there's a segment of the population that associated with addiction, and but we're not. Addiction doesn't pertain only to gaming. There's people addicted to their work, to other things, right? So yeah, exactly. So that could possibly. But the other is that I see gaming as much broader than the traditional, as Michael described, traditional understanding of game, but that it could be. That there's elements of it that we are already very familiar with. For example, collecting points when you're using a particular credit card and those kinds of things, and collecting air miles is another one of those, right? It's a form of gamification, and when you point out to people that it's a lot more common, you're actually involved in it more than you think, then it helps people develop insight. And the other is that not everybody, believe it or not, I actually do not enjoy games, like digital games. And I have a whole family that is just addicted and glued to it, and they'll talk in these languages I don't understand and how many levels they, and it's always been that way in my family. I just have I'm not interested in it. And so if you push that on me, I wouldn't be one of those that would be interested in games. So I think it's important for people to also recognize that it doesn't have to apply to everyone, and that they just need to understand what makes them tick and what motivates them, and then gamify that, right? It doesn't have to be the traditional sort of platforms that we are familiar with.
Yeah. I really echo what she just said. I was doing my PhD in a remote island in Portugal, and like in a lot of the islands, it tends to happen, technology comes a little bit later. So every time when I was going to talk to the older adults there and to kind of like bring this idea of using games as a way to physical training, a lot of them were actually mentioning, like, games are a waste of my time. Literally, that was the thing that I was constantly getting from them. So understanding from what is that coming, that led me to like rethink the way that I was trying to bring the games, and what they were basically, why they were basically saying that. It was because they were saying they were constantly seeing their grandchildren 4 or 5 hours seated in a very sedentary, monotonous behavior, playing their games, and that was the perception that they had about games. When we were trying to bring those games, we were certainly asking, like, what are the activities that you normally enjoy? We discovered that was touristic activities in Portugal related to wine, related to grapes, related to harvesting. And then when you started creating those activities in a digital manner, in a way that they haven't seen it before, and you start like bringing a little bit of more meaningful meaning to those games rather than like, FPS or other types of games that they are not very used, or when you connect those digital experiences with things like board games that they have been playing them for a long period of time, card games of those. When you start bringing those little elements, you immediately see the way that they are engaging your conversations and the way that they open up to bring more ideas to the table to design those games is really phenomenal.
Absolutely. So we want to get on to audience questions. So I just wanted to ask you guys one more quick question before moving on to the audience, which is that, right now we've smart home technology, mobile apps, VR, these are very, current technologies. But, what technologies do you think are going to be cutting edge in health, in the coming years? I'm asking you to predict the future a little bit, which I know is a favorite thing for scientists to do.
I mean, I think there's great potential for health metrics and the way in which we consume those to inform our actions and decisions to take place. So John was referring to collecting biosignals, right? There's this idea that there are signals that can be detected that are being generated from our bodies that relate to our experience, right? And we know that some of those things are really important to detect early, right? They may be the determinants of poor or good health in the future. And some of those are very difficult to detect, or they may be inaccessible, or they're not practical in our health system to, go see a specialist and a specialist and a specialist and a specialist, after years, and finally it's detected. If we can enable people to have a device that can detect these things early, that can be helpful for them. So I think there's a potential for that within the next 20 years. I mean, a lot of people will point to AI and say it's going to help us. AI currently will, based on the amount of data that's available, come up with a predictive model with a certain amount of certainty and say, I predict that you'll fall into this Plinko category. The great thing right now is nobody knows how it figured that out, right? And so, will we accept, to inform our decisions based on, artificial intelligence without knowing what's under the hood? That's, I think, going to be the big determining thing probably in the next 5 to 10 years. And what comes out of that, I think, will lead to whatever technologies will be there 20 years from now.
That's so interesting right now, too, when I'm sure everyone's felt over the pandemic that it's so hard to physically see a doctor in real life, to physically meet with someone. So, those things would make such a difference when that's getting more and more difficult.
Looking at me?
Yeah, no pressure, Lili, but any thoughts?
Okay, I'm going to slightly modify your question, and that is that in fact, I see coming up in the future, what I would like to see in the next 10 or even 20 years is adoption and these outcome measures catching up to the technology. I think the technology has reached a point where 25, 30 years ago when we started tele-rehab in Western Canada, the technology has improved immensely. It's now wireless and not using telephone lines, etc. But the adoption, the behavior hasn't nearly met that speed of development. I can see technology, sure, refining, being much more, but until CRTC or the government or policy makes internet and wireless telecommunication affordable to not just urban but rural sites. I was visiting Six Nations recently. I could not believe how drastically different my internet and my wireless changed as soon as I got into there. They're still using telephone dial-up for transactions and things like that. There's no reason. It's such a developed area of our region. I don't see why it would stop there. So there's so many issues related to that. Until we can resolve that access and make it affordable, we're not going to see smart homes taking off. Yeah. You can't do remote monitoring of medication, all of that. You can't bring in the fantastic technologies that are developed south of the border or in Europe, which we are replicating, reinventing the wheel when we don't have to, because they don't want to come into Canada because they cannot afford, their businesses would not survive with the rate of cost for internet monitoring, because we're relying on these wireless things. So I know I'm getting on my soapbox. I always try and pitch that sort of a sore spot, because so it's an infrastructure that we're not, and I know our population is not, we don't have the critical mass that the Americans or the Europeans or China has, but we need to resolve that before our technology. I would say is that adoption. So my colleague Antonio Miguel Cruz and I recently just published a paper in Healthcare Management Forum, and it was called the Adoption and Diffusion Technology Post-COVID-19. Essentially, for the first time historically in our world globally, we have this period in time where adoption refers to adoption of technologies by individuals over a period of time. We're talking about diffusion. In this two and a half year period, there was massive adoption, which is diffusing. So it'd be interesting to see what happens, which technologies stay and changes the way of practice. Will those billing codes continue to incorporate and allow consults between physicians and even specialists in certain cases, so that access is addressed right. So I see in the next 20 years or so, I hope, this is what I pray for, is a catch up, and then also addressing the ethical, legal issues related to data and ownership of data. And if I'm an individual newly diagnosed with dementia and I know that I'm underrepresented or I'm Indigenous and that this research is really relying on my data, why is it that I cannot allow my data to be shared with experts anonymously or de-identified, those kinds of things? So I hope that we can make some progress in that area that will affect the innovations, but will be innovation in a different way, not the technology, hardware and software. I'm starting to see, and hopefully we'll see more of as well, the industry start to change. So why require people to sign on for 12-year agreements like you do with mobile phones? Why not let them lease these kinds of detection devices and things, so that when they no longer need it in 6 months in their long-term care, they can just give it up without having to incur the cost of. So I'm starting to see that in at least one company that we work with, but I'd like to see more changes in those. So I consider those to be innovations as well.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic answer. I mean, it just really shows how these things are all linked, you know, adoption, accessibility, equity, you know, especially equity of technology and of internet, you know, it's all intrinsically linked. Yeah.
We'll just shortly add something that I always have been ambitioning to have, especially in the Games for Health area, and that's social connection. Like, there's so many, you know, examples of interesting games that people develop that are only played by single players, and they are really missing the power of connecting more people, doing a similar activity or a collaborative activity or a competitive activity that is actually meaningful for them, and how that can really boost the engagement that they are feeling every time that they are doing it. So I would really love to see more, you know, technologies that allow to connect people remotely, doing activities that are, you know, meaningful for them, and at the same time are sharing their experiences using voice chat or using then you don't need to carry that much about how the game is encouraging players to keep playing it, because that's what you need if you do a therapeutic game. But it's like, you know, how do you create vehicles to allow more players to be connected, so then they will encourage themselves. They will show up just because they feel that there's a social connection aspect to those things, and we see the, you know, that the power of that social connection happening in the multiplayer platforms that we see with a lot of the, you know, children and teenagers playing now Roblox, playing now Minecraft, but you know, that's not happening with games that are supposed to be created for therapeutic purposes. And I think that's something that we as research scientists are really part of the picture that we're missing.
Yeah, absolutely. Moved on to a question from the audience that was in the chat. If faculty of health students are interested in serious games but have limited experience, are there opportunities to gain a deeper understanding of games and virtual technologies and hand-on experience?
I would say so, yes. So I would contact, you know, not every faculty has to have expertise in everything, but if you're interested in a particular, what you just described, Emma, without repeating you, then I would say contact faculty members. There are a few that are either members of the Games Institute, and then through this membership, we can certainly connect with others to bring that team of expertise, whether it be an undergraduate thesis, whether it be a co-op kind of an experience, or a thesis for a master's or a PhD. I think those definitely have to see more interest.
Yeah.
Just add to that, as we mentioned, this is one of the first sort of hybrid in-person slash virtual meetings from the Games Institute. And as the, you know, limitations are lifted, you're going to see a lot more of this. And so those of you who haven't been part of the Games Institute or knew about it, if you're new to the campus, what made this place so amazing and still amazing is the ability to connect people through multiple events. So whether it's speaker panels, guest speakers, game jams, or just coffee and toast socials, like everybody on campus is welcome to come to these. And so I'd also contact us here at the Games Institute if you're not already on the listserv, so that you can find out like what sorts of events are going on, because we welcome everybody to get engaged.
Yeah, I think especially coming from more like an engineering background and working more in engineering, I think we probably need to foster more spaces where we sit down, a lot of people with different engineering background, different design background, with people in healthcare that are bringing real needs, and not needs that are created out of the sky in a research laboratory, which happens all the time. So I think we really need more that cohesive moment somewhere, and I'm actually, you know, very open towards at some point bringing more, you know, demoing a lot of these technologies in the healthcare faculty, or promoting more of these events, because those are the the moments and when you team up with people from different backgrounds, where I see the real interesting projects and not like, very biased opinions or projects about the role of the technology in something that I don't really understand, or the potential role of something I don't really understand, but I believe can be a solution for this specific healthcare problem.
There are many organizations and service providers such as Schlegel, Villages, the rehab, institutes actually across the country where we do work with many. Agewell as well. Agewell investigators on campus are very interested and we can make these connections so that we can test that. A lot of the games and products that we've developed through Agewell are available for free for researchers that want to use without,
The last thing I'll add to that question is, if you look at the Games Institute website, we have bios listed of faculty members and grad student members and postdoc members that games they've worked on or research interests. So, if you want to get in touch with someone specifically, that might be a way you'd like to work with.
Quickly to that.
Yeah, of course.
The Game Institute is very interested in bringing people together who want to do these kinds of things. So by all means, talk to, again, any of the panelists here. John mentioned this as well, an interest in these sorts of activities, but we'll support in any way we can students on campus who want to come and say, you know what, I want to learn more about games and health, serious game health, and we'll try to advertise this thing and put it out for people to come here. So it's not a space where we necessarily have all the chocolate bars in the world, but the fact is there's space here, and we welcome that kind of collaborative thinking. And then you find out what you want to do, what other kinds of organizations to get in touch with, and you'll get lots of information from people who are already thinking these ways. So I wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you. From the lips of the executive director himself.
In orange.
In orange. So next I have a question from Andrew for John. I wonder if there are any examples of how virtual reality and games can be used to train police officers or search and rescue personnel in conducting a missing persons search.
Yeah, that probably comes back to experience that I have back in 2018 when I was finishing my PhD. I got the opportunity to work with a company that licensed some patents about biofeedback in games. They were trying to use that as a way to de-escalate conflicts in police officers. That's Hampton, Virginia. So I think there is a huge potential, especially right now, with all the crazy things that are happening in the Wild West, to use this technology as a way to better train people like first responders or law enforcement, people that are in charge of public safety, to better respond to things that are normally happening where they probably don't have a good control, they don't have a good self-regulation skills built upon, and how these technologies can really immerse these people into scenarios that are very much controlled by trainers, very much controlled by people that are constantly developing strategies to foster that self-regulation promotion and to disseminate those and make them more accessible. Because in the past, this training, it really requires a specific location, very well equipped, a lot of money being thrown on it. Whereas nowadays, this type of more immersive VR training, for instance, can be sort of easily accessible by $500 and porting the content on it. You will be able to train very important skills while keeping things more or less scalable. So I think that project actually led to my following job. So I'm actually tomorrow starting a job with the same company when they just realize how important this is becoming right now for helping veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder, how to help these police officers to better de-escalate those situations by using this technology that is supposed to be initially for games, but it's really being extended more towards enterprise and training capabilities.
That's great. So now we have some time for questions from the audience. If anyone wants to unmute the virtual audience and ask a question. No pressure, but you could show your face too. We've got a screen here, we can see you. And if not, we'll move into in-person questions. We can always come back if you suddenly come up with a question. Okay, anyone in person then? Neil.
Okay, I'm not quite sure what I'm asking here, but the focus in games and health, I'm only at VR and health, whatever, tends to be on health. All right, that's only understandable. I'm thinking about the Wii Fit as an example of a device that was specifically about activity and health and all this sort of thing. And I mean, one of the problems with it is that game players tended to cheat when it came to the Wii Fit. I mean, I remember my nephew, who is disabled and could very much have made use of this, finding out a way to sit like I'm sitting and bowl by just doing this kind of thing and not really getting any exercise whatsoever. What I'm trying to figure out is, and given the population of people who enjoy playing games, this is not to suggest that everybody does, as you were talking about, Lily, should we or might we focus more on the game with the health aspects coming as a result of trying to get better and better in the game? I'm not saying we don't a certain thing, but maybe that's an area, because we tend to focus so much of, we want to build games into daily activities without saying, well, maybe what we reverse that, saying, let's get people to play games better. And in doing so, we'll build in the daily activities. It's kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of the opposite of gamification, which is real worldification inside a game or something like. I wonder, I mean, you have to learn how to design really good games that way. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, given the population of game-playing people. I don't know. Go ahead, including shooting down the question entirely. Which is
Okay. It's interesting you bring that up because, yeah, I have seen lots of cheating in the Wii Fit, lying down, golfing, and stuff. Yeah. And actually, I find it quite amusing, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because unless there's an actual goal to, in the child or the individual understands that it's these movements we're looking for, and if you're going to do it, you're cheating your therapy, regardless of the gamer. But essentially, what they're doing is gaming the game, which is quite fun, actually. I think. And in fact, you know, if there's a child who is in a wheelchair and can't do those movements, but can somehow win the game by just flicking the wrist, then more power to them, right? So in some ways, it kind of levels the playing field for certain people, if that's what. So I think there's different perspectives, but I don't actually see anything wrong with cheating in the game. I wouldn't call it cheating. I would just say, wow, they found a way to get past the, you know.
I think cheating is just an expression of creativity, right?
Right.
And if you think about it, right, and you do it in the real world, you can do it in the virtual world. I think the trick is, how did the designers get that feedback? How do you catch the cheaters, right? Yeah. Not just to then, you know, the version 2.0, you know, resolves this virtual bowling hack that people have figured out. But what does it also say about how motivated people are? Like, this person discovered this technique to still score high points and get around the physical activity part. I mean, the body will also, the mind and the body will, you know, try to minimize, you know, energy output too, right? Unless you have the motivation to move. And I think, you know, sometimes when you design these like Wii Fit scenarios or things that are supposed to engage with the body, you naively assume that, you know, the content will drive the movement. Well, it might initially, but then, you know, you're also like, you're wired to figure out how to minimize that, right? If you're playing, you know, a sport, for example, you're actively trying to minimize your trajectory, you know, to achieve whatever goal. So we do this anyway. So maybe we don't have a good enough sense of creating cheat detectors. And some of this comes from the really hard problem, especially in sort of the digital space of games, of creating the content. It's hard. It takes a lot of people, a lot of creative minds, a lot of time to develop really good content. And the more immersive you want to make it, the more it involves like physical engines that are trying to, you know, model the laws of physics and all that, the harder it is to get to that point. And then maybe you just don't need that level of immersion. But if you don't have that level, the likelihood of coming up with hacks and workarounds is probably going to increase. So it gets back to educating the users of what is the purpose of this, right? And yeah, I mean, I find it amusing too, right? When you see people do this, but we have to do a better job of observing that and learning from those instances.
I'm glad you mentioned sports. I was actually coming, and I'll just stop here. But I came out of the sports idea. I have never been known as somebody who runs a whole lot, right? I think that's the minimum I could possibly say about that. But throw a soccer ball on the field, and the fact that there's somebody stopping me from scoring a goal, and I'll run until I pass out. So it has nothing to do with the running. It has to do with scoring the goal. And that's where if you shift that focus into winning the game, and people don't like competition, that's fine, but it drove me. So there's an interesting sort of area to move into. But you're right, the content is paramount in that sense, and that's enormously hard to produce. Okay.
Well, and one interesting anecdote, just thinking about, cheating is creativity and different ways of doing things. Over the pandemic, the Ring Fit game was an enormously popular exercise game. It was like flew off shelves. It was impossible to get. And a thing that's very popular in the gaming community is speed running. Basically being like, can I play Super Mario Brothers in 3 minutes somehow? And people were actually buying Ring Fit and speed running Ring Fit, which is like incredible when you think about it, because it's sort of a creative, it's not cheating, but it is a sort of creative misuse of the game. And it's probably really not physically a good idea to try to play this whole game in one sitting, but finding ways to creatively use the game to get through it quickly, and they'd be pouring in sweat by the time they were done their stream. But I think that's kind of a good example of taking the way we think about games and what makes games fun, and then applying them to something that was meant to be for exercise.
And I think that's actually the perfect information that as game designers we could use to build up, like rather than doing it as you guys were mentioning in the past, like taking the paper and pencil task and trying to see how to cover that broccoli with a lot of chocolate at the top. It's like, what is the chocolate behind that, and how can we create a good chocolate behind that, and then we will more or less handle the broccoli somehow. So, and I think there's a tremendous amount of good information about those games and how people modify and do those modifications in games to make them super fun. And again, that's how also when you see and when you try to involve those healthcare practitioners, they have a lot of those little small anecdotes that they say, like, that was super fun for this specific population. How you can transform that little thing, anecdote, video that they have into something that has levels, as a character, has like nice aesthetics, and has a very meaningful game mechanic. So the potential players will be able to enjoy that in a long period of time, and not something that they will only play for 5 minutes and they will get bored.
Right. Well, that's good. I was just thinking about detecting cheating is important, but quitting is important too. You just referred to that there too. And this is really important, like in terms of when you're designing and co-designing content. John, you mentioned a couple of times about having researchers having preconceived notions about what the best thing to study is or the best content to create. And one of the things that'll happen if you do that is, the end users quite frequently will say, this isn't fun, or they'll express something where they just simply quit it. And so that gets back to the need to involve more people in the iterative loop of the design process, and respecting moments of cheating, moments of quitting, basically deviant behavior from what you're expecting to do. And not just treat those as outliers, but really try to figure out how do you solve that. And sometimes how do you just simply accept it? That some people will just simply cheat for the sake of cheating, speedrun for the sake of speedrunning. And in the speedrun case, it's neat because it's like, what are they doing? Well, they're pushing to excel, right? And you can say, why are they hurting their bodies, perhaps, right? Pushing themselves to the limit. You could pick any Olympic sport, in the training process. Is it really a great idea? How many people suffer injuries towards getting to the Olympics and never get praised, because they seriously injure themselves? And just thinking about injury and games and how much people use it, and not thinking about esports now. Esports is exploding, huge amounts of money, lots of engagement, and very little information when you look into it about the injuries that are happening. People are gaming, speed running, they're pushing the limits of what they can do physically, because at the end of the day, most of this is button pushing with your hands, on controllers that were not designed yet to sustain that many hours of videos. Within, many people that don't understand, the fine motor control learning that has to occur to perform really well and excellently in these sports. So that's going to be another interesting thing. Games for Health will also be like the injuries that occur from games, the way that they're currently designed, how do we prevent them in the future?
Well, thinking about bringing age into it, you have these people aging out of esports at 24, 25 because of these injuries. So yeah. So we're just out of time now. Agata is going to draw the door prize quick, and then we'll do a round of applause.
I have a very official drawing tool here. It's a lunchbox that I actually got from one of our former postdoctoral fellows. So I will just show you the online audience at least. See, there's stuff here, and all of your names were added. So I think Salma, our operations coordinator, who did that. So I'll mess those up. But before I go there, a couple of words of acknowledgement and thanks. First of all, to the panelists, thank you very much for taking your time. I know it's summer and we're all like going on vacation and stuff, but we really appreciate you being here. Thanks, Emma, for moderating today and prepping the panelists, because it always looks as if like it just happened. There was a lot of work before that. So, and I don't think the camera likes me, so I'm gonna stand here.
We can share.
That's right. So Emma has been working with the panelists to make sure that this panel was as engaging as possible for those of you here and online. So, and we actually have a good 16 people online, I believe. So, though you couldn't see them, there was quite a few people listening. So, with that, Salma, come over.
Come draw now.
And draw something. Because you didn't see, but Salma did a lot of the preparations today, so I figured.
Susan Elliott.
Susan Elliott, all right. Susan, I think you're online.
Congrats, Susan.
We will be in touch. There's Susan. Flashed for us for a moment. Susan will be.
There I am.
Congratulations. Lily's book will be going your way. We'll be in touch where you want it shipped to.
You can just put it in campus mail.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for joining us. Another thank you to Pam. She's sitting right behind me there-ish, someplace. Pam is our project manager here and facilitator for the Games Institute, and a lot of the work in the background happens because of her. And all the social media that you have or will be seeing about this event will be done by Salma, and she was also busy taking pictures today. So thank you very much for joining us, and I think we are at time.
And thank you to Agata as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, no, Agata doesn't want thanks. Agata just wants vacation. So to those of you online, we will be finishing very shortly. We also will have the recording of today's panel available for those who couldn't join us online. Or in person, and Neil is waving at me. What would you like to say, Neil?
Drowning, not waving. Yes, thanks to Agata. She is going on vacation starting tomorrow, so you'll have lots of time to think of this, waiting for 5 or 6 hours at Pearson.
Oh, shut up.
Just saying. But actually, and while all of us are very busy people, I want to acknowledge Lily being here, because deans don't have time. Flat out. End of discussion. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And for those of you online, thank you very much for joining us.